Midnight Men by Jay Wilburn. The Crimson Bloodshed, the most feared ship on the ocean, with the most feared captain even among his own pirate crew, came upon an unsettling sight as they sailed west between the islands. Shy Tempest was on watch in the crow's nest, and he saw the dark thing upon the bright water before he could properly identify what it was. Alice Crimson, the recent bride of Captain Mad Red Crimson, stepped out to the front of the ship and knew exactly what she saw, even if she did not yet understand it. Pieces of wooden debris floated upon the waves between them and the object. Splintered panels, curved and broken planks, and bits of torn cloth littered the water and spoke let's say spoke of. I know this is supposed to be a reading. I shouldn't be fixing things. Spoke of another ship that had been sunk hard. "Go get the captain, Lucian," she ordered. "I believe I give the orders around here before you do." Lucian slurred his words even though it was hardly past midday. "Why don't you wake him your own self, since it was your dirty love what put him to sleeping?" Alice met his blurry eyes and considered his shitty little smirk. "You and I can have ourselves an argument. We can even throw fists over it if it makes you feel more the man. After it's over, we'll get my husband involved and see which of us gets in the most trouble. What do you say, Lucian Cable?" "I say I want no part of that trouble, Alice dear." She pointed with two fingers and said, "Then get your ass to his door and wake the captain. Tell him we've sighted a ship in distress, possibly set fire, and still afloat." Lucian turned his eyes away, lost his smirk, and shuffled off to rouse Mad Red. Tobias Merck stepped up beside Alice. He eyed the strange dark vessel beyond the scattered debris and finally said, "Lucian is no good at taking orders from anyone, if it makes you feel better, dear." He seemed to go along fine once it were explained to him. Tobias laughed. "I suppose he did at that." Before the captain stepped out, much of the crew had lined the railing to take in the queer scene. The ship was painted pure black. Not a blemish of other color or faded boards from the sun showed anywhere. The vessel flew no flag for any country, nor one of the many pirate banners neither. The key to the ship's interest for Alice, her husband, and the crew was the fact that this ship tilted slightly to one side. The ship's sails, also pitch black, were mostly down. One was down so far that it puddled upon the center of the deck, loose of its moorings. A single secondary sail still raised, but full of so many tears and wide open rips that it hardly made a noise in the ocean winds blowing through. Think it were burned?" Tobias raised the end of his words to punctuate a question. Alice shook her head. "Hard to tell when everything were already black as char. That hardly seems natural, not so complete like that, and still afloat to boot. The broken pieces of whatever sunk show no black. Find it odd, I do." Tobias tilted his head. "You think they washed their ship that dark color on purpose and it's not burned that shade? Would make a ship hard to spot at night and hard to figure out in the day. Hell, the night crew might walk right off the sides, not able to see where the deck ended. No ship burned that badly could still be afloat even at an angle were I to guess. You can see here that the pieces of the deck are still in place. That's not all burned wood." "Then I've seen nothing like it in all my days," Tobias confessed. Lucian stepped up beside Alice on her other side. "Madam Crimson, you lost son?" she asked. "No, I roused the captain as requested, or ordered rather. Just wanted to be sure there were no hard feelings, nothing Mad Red needed concern himself with, I mean." Alice smiled. "I think we're fine for now, but let's see how the day goes forward." Tobias bellowed a laugh that echoed across the water between the ships. A floating red cloth that might have been a torn shirt slapped up against the hull of the Crimson Bloodshed. It held stuck there a moment, but was then swept under in the wake. The crew parted and backed farther away from the rails than was probably necessary, but when dealing with Captain Crimson, safe was far better than sorry. Red's beard was wild from sleep, but not that much different from any typical waking hour. He wore a yellow and blue bandana over his head, but not his fancy hat. One eye stared out from his wrinkled face with a whitish cataract film that many would wear a patch over, but he saw no need. His vest was buttoned up. He was one buttonhole off all the way up and down. No one would point it out to him, not even his beloved Alice. He often wore a pile of other coats when they were raiding a ship, but not this hot day. Lucian might have mentioned to him that the ship in question appeared to be abandoned and possibly burned. He ran the 3 fingers remaining on his left hand through his wife's hair. She smiled up at him. Mad Red showed her his teeth in a broad smile that sent the crew back another couple steps. Some of his teeth were as black as the ship they approached alongside. "What do you think of this, my dear Alice?" "I think it's worth exploring, but we should arm up for the possibility that trouble still lurks." "Trouble do always lurk, I find," he kept smiling as he nodded. "You'll make a fine captain yourself soon." From the edge of her vision she saw the expressions and bodies of the crew shift at that compliment. It was fine. If any of them needed correction on any subject, she would provide as required. He took his hand from her hair and called to the crew, "We're going over. Alice leads with Merc as her second." And that was that. Scene break. The sun was cutting across the water at a sinking angle out of the west. It would be dark in another hour or two at the outside. Tobias and Alice got along with their boarding party and each other just fine. When there seemed to be nothing much to plunder and no one to fight, it was a simple enough operation, even if dissatisfying. Shy Tempest climbed the stairs back to the main deck. His eyes darted from First Mate Merc to Bride Alice and back again. He reported to both. It's taking on water, and there are signs of death and bloody struggle on every deck. The leak is slow and only knee-deep on the low side of the lowest deck. There's coffins down there afloat and bumping about. Some of the fellows are searching the bodies. We got some weapons, but not much else. Alice sighed and said, "Let's hope there's no plague or pox upon those boxed bodies they're fiddling with down there, I pray." Tobias and Shy exchanged a wide-eyed look. Shy said, "I never considered it. Sorry, Madam Scarlet." Other crewmen opened the door to the unoccupied captain's quarters as they finished bagging up a few trinkets. Alice wondered if any of them dared to try to hide any items from Mad Red when they went back. She guessed they wouldn't dare, but stupid was often more powerful than fear or anything else. "We got one alive over here," Lucian called. Tobias, Alice, Shy, and a couple others went to Lucian's voice. He stood in a sagging section of the deck near the aft section. Broken gear and part of a collapsed sail had covered a body that Lucian discovered to still be breathing. The fallen man's mouth still moved like a preacher spitting hellfire. "What's he saying?" Tobias asked. "It's all rant and whisper." Lucian stood and took a step back from his discovery. "He won't be ranting long with his guts all spilled in his lap like that." Alice had been looking upon the bright blues and reds of his coat that stood out so from the uniform darkness of every surface of this ship, with no name and no living crew before this poor fellow. When Lucian mentioned the man's guts, Alice realized that she thought some of that ropey intestine had been actual ropes from the sails. "Are you an officer of some stripe?" she asked. "Are you mad?" Tobias whispered. Alice knelt down beside the dying man and shifted his shoulder for Tobias and the others to see. More crew started to gather as this was the only action on the lilting vessel. Well, I'll be damned," Tobias said. "What is a nice officer of the Crown doing out here on a ship like this?" "Bleeding," Lucian answered. The other crew around him obliged with laughter and a few shoves. "It isn't his ship," she said, "and I don't know why he'd be raiding a ship like this or any other." "Coat could be stolen," a fellow said. Others grumbled their agreement. "His ship could be the one at the bottom of the drink while this one is still slowly sinking," Tobias suggested. The crew grumbled louder. They liked this idea even better than the stolen coat. "Did you see any cannons on board to sink a royal ship or any other?" she countered. They looked at one another without a grumble left in them. "No, dear," Lucian finally responded. The dying officer suddenly raised his voice. "Lear is coming." It was so startling that a few crew members looked about as if this person Lear were coming up behind them. "Who's Lear?" Alice asked beside the officer who was starting to shake. "The oldest one." His voice cracked part way through, and the rest of his words were rolling gravel. "King of the Midnight Men." Everyone stood quietly as the officer's eyes slid closed and he seemed to deflate in the debris around him. Tobias began, "What do you suppose?" Lucian drove a boot heel into the man's slippery guts and twisted from side to side. The officer's eyes flew open and he screamed. Lucian demanded, "Explain who these midnight men are." "Cursed of God," the officer choked out the answer. "Men of the coffin. They come at night. Better that you be." This time the officer's eyes stayed open, but the light snuffed right out from behind them. Lucian twisted his boot in the man's open belly a little more, but got no reaction this time. That last bit was more mystery than answer, I'd say. Tobias looked to Alice. Lucian stepped back from the corpse and left bloody prints from one of his boots. On the black deck, the blood looked like dark, greasy oil. I should have worn my sharper heels. The crew laughed, but that was cut off with the screams from below deck. Alice stood as she thought about floating coffins. Thundering steps hammered up from below. Men drew their swords and pulled their flintlocks as they moved to the mouth of the stairs and waited. One of their own crew emerged between them with blood painting one side of his face and that shoulder as well. It was bright and glistening compared to the bloody footprints dark against the deck. He made it 3 running steps across the surface before another figure launched from the darkness into the bleeding man's back. The others lifted their weapons, but none of them moved to swipe or to fire. The pursuer, a person none of them recognized, opened his mouth with a carnal growl. He had ivory sabers instead of upper teeth. He used these to bite into the back of the neck of the screaming and bleeding crewmate. The 2 of them, locked in a deadly struggle, tumbled across the deck. The attacker stood and lifted the crewman, whom he still bit into bodily in the air. Lifting their weapons again, they still did not act because the attacker burst into flames. Alice couldn't explain the spontaneous combustion. I misspelled that. Hold on. All right. It should be a reading, so I shouldn't stop to fix things, but I can't help myself. But it made her think that maybe the ship had been burned after all. The burning man ran for the railing and crashed through it as he fell to the cluttered water between ships. The newly broken sections of wood were a dull ashy gray on the inside. What the bloody hell? Shy Tempest asked, with his flintlock still loaded. The sounds of struggle rose from every opening and vibrated the deck under their feet. 3 impacts from below bent up the boards into rough hills. Nails went flying, and black splinters of wood, as long and as thick as daggers, scattered around their feet. 2 more men with saber-like teeth emerged from below. The last light of the setting sun illuminated their skin too pale to be alive. They growled louder as they ignited like torches. One burning creature took the fire below deck. The other hurled himself off the side and splashed down. Men below deck screamed for help. "Shall we go ourselves?" Tobias asked as he pointed to the stairs down into the noisy darkness. "Or would we send these other men for aid?" "I'm not going down there if they burn up here," she said. Tobias nodded and said, "I'm not too keen on staying up here either, dear Alice. Would you have us abandon ship?" He met her eyes. "If we decided so together, would be harder for any man who survived long enough to get back on the crimson bloodshed to fault us. I say we abandon the ship and maybe even fire upon it to sink the bitch," Alice Crimson said. Tobias smiled a yellowed grin and drew in breath to presumably give the order, but he never said the words. The sun had died in the water at the western horizon. There was still a bit of light in hues of purple, just a shade or 3 above the black of night. Standing on this tilting deck, painted pure black, made it appear they were floating in space instead of standing on anything solid. Tobias closed his mouth as a few bodies more than he saw drop into the water now exploded back out into the air. These fanged demons flew like spirits and swirled above their heads. The soaking wet creatures did not burn any longer in the air as they dove in for attack. The boarding party left upon the deck did manage to fire off a few shots this time. The flying musket balls tore through the monsters' clothing and bodies, but did not fell the creatures. They sunk their teeth in more crewmen and lifted them into the air. A white-haired man with teeth just as bright ran up the stairs and at both Tobias and Alice with fingernails as long as black claws at the ends of his curled digits. They slashed at him with their swords and cut him to pieces, but he kept pressing the attack. Alice slipped on broken pieces of wood and fell hard to her back. Her sword slid away along the damaged deck. The monster lunged at her, but Tobias impaled it and shoved it to the side, as being stabbed through wasn't quite enough to stop the creature entirely. Both Tobias and the monster struggled over the sword still impaled in the creature's chest. They twisted up and fell to the deck together as well. Alice fumbled to find her sword, but she only came up with one of the dagger-sized splinters. In desperation, she stabbed the wood down into the creature's chest as well. It did not go nearly as deep as the metal, but the monster arched its back and screamed with the torment of hell itself. Smoke billowed from his wide open mouth, but he did not burst into flames like the creatures that came out in the sun earlier. "Why won't you just die?" she bellowed. Did I use bellowed twice? No. In the face, still showing its deadly fangs, Alice Crimson pulled Tobias's blood-slicked sword from the monster's chest and brought it down like a club. The blade sliced through the creature's throat more like a cleaver than a club. The head rolled away and the body lit up like a torch. Other monsters circling above flew farther away from the burning light. Tobias held up Alice's sword and they traded blades. "What are these things?" he asked, close to her ear as the sounds of battle continued all around them. "The Midnight Men, I assume," she answered. He actually laughed at that and stalked after the others. He declared, "Their heads. You have to cut off their heads to kill them, you fools." In the light of the burning body, Alice looked upon the other splintered stakes around her feet. On a hunch, she took up a few more of them. Lucian Cable crammed his blade sideways into a monster's mouth to hold it away. The curved fangs scraped along the sharp edge close to his face. Alice stabbed a stake through the creature's back and into its heart. As its skin started to smoke and before it could collapse, Alice swung her blade through its neck and sent the head tumbling. She used her boot to kick the body over the railing. It ignited in the air and hissed out in the waves below. She handed over a couple stakes to Lucian with the instructions, "Go for the heart with wood and then take the head with metal. Go." This time he ran to follow the order without complaint. Alice circled the deck, dispatched one demon after another, but they kept climbing out of the lower decks. She froze as she saw Shy Tempest fighting the officer in the blue and red coat. The gutted fellow had fangs of his own, but they were not very long. His belly still hung open and his bowels strung out behind him to underneath the collapsed sail where they had found him and surely watched him die. "What is this?" she breathed. The dead officer turned his eyes to her and they glowed red. "Lear is coming for you all." "Tell him I'm sorry we couldn't stay longer." She took off his head with a hard swing and let his body set the fallen sail ablaze. Alice grabbed Shy by the shoulder and yelled into his face, "If you value your skin, help me get the survivors of our crew off this demon ship." Shy moved quickly and the surviving men fought their way across the deck to the boats they had used to reach the black ship in the daylight. As the monsters thinned out and the tilting vessel really did start to burn, some of their fallen crewmen stood with red eyes and came after those trying to leave them behind. More undead crew climbed out from below. They were bloody messes, but they seemed to have plenty of energy to turn on their fellows in the remnant of the boarding party. Yet a couple more climbed up the side of the ship from the waters. They still bled from pairs of holes in their neck, but they joined the next wave of the attack. Unfortunately for these resurrected crewmates, with their glowing red eyes, they weren't as strong as the creatures already aboard, and the survivors had already figured out the secret. These men were quickly staked to dispose of their threat. A few were decapitated to boot, but many were just left prone on the deck of the burning ship as the rest made their escape. They rowed away with vigor, only to find a couple more boats rowing toward them from the crimson bloodshed. Alice cried out, "Turn about, you fools, we're retreating, not attacking." Scant debris from the ship that might have sunk scraped the low sides of their boats as they went. One boat flipped over, and pale hands with sharp black claws dragged the spilled men under the dark waves. The rest rowed onward, and a second boat broke apart. The men tried to reach the other boats, but they too were dragged under the waves. Alice prayed to a god she long ago stopped believing in, that if she had to die under the water, it would not be this night, and it would be sharks that ate her, and not these demons. The rest made it back. Tobias, Shy, and Lucian were among the survivors. Another man in the nest above the crimson bloodshed cried out, "More ships approach." Any other night they would have likely missed them, but their eyes had adjusted to the murky paint jobs. Captain Crimson lifted his own spyglass and said, "These ships are as black as the cursed thing lighting the night next to us." "Someone named Lear, who might be their king, is coming," Alice said, "and I'd be happy to never meet him." Mad Red Crimson looked into his wife's eyes and came as close to showing real fear as he had any day of his life. He ordered the ship about, and they made to flee. That was when some of the demons also abandoned the black, burning ship and landed aboard the crimson bloodshed from the air. The fight started again as the crew did their best to set sail in the midst of the chaos. They staked the invading monsters and were careful to cut off the invaders' heads over the side so they would burn upon the water and not set this ship alight as well. The black fleet of the Midnight Men closed the distance, but the crimson bloodshed was a fast vessel indeed. Still, the Dark Armada did not give up the chase. They didn't even slow down to deal with their burning vessel. The crew prepared cannons, but the enemy wasn't close enough to fire upon yet. More than once men reported seeing the fanged demons in the air behind them. The crew prepared themselves with wooden stake, blades, and a few guns for good measure. In the end, none of the flying demons reached the pirate ship. The retreat continued through the night. Alice said over and over that she believed if they could survive until daylight, they'd be able to get away for good. The sun did rise, but the black ships kept coming. I thought that would do it, Alice lamented. These kind, Mad Red said, employ a human crew for daylight. You've heard of these fanged midnight men? Tobias asked his captain. Only in legend, he answered. What I do know is that there are no mortal men who can outrun us, so we will still lose them in the day. Mad Red changed course more than once as they came upon the small islands. The dark fleet, manned by their day crews, split up to try to head the pirate ship off and hem them in. Red had his ship lay low in a cove for a few hours. He then set sail west once more after the scattered fleet had missed them. Exhausted teams had manned the cannons all night, but not a one was fired. I know we're all tired, Captain Crimson growled, but I give not a damn for your feelings, men, and I never will. We will sail on through the day, watch for these dark ships in the coming nights, and I believe their day crews will suffer for having let us escape. The exhausted men still cheered for their captain. And if you live through the night, especially from the boarding party, the captain said, then you have Alice to thank for your worthless hides. They cheered for Alice with a little less enthusiasm. Mad Red Crimson said, now, we search your body for bites. Every member of the boarding party is still with us, and every crewman... that needs to be singular. Sorry about that. I shouldn't be making edits, but I'm going to do it anyway. And every crewman who fought the intruders upon this deck, stripped down to your skin in the daylight, that we might be sure you're not infected. You too, dear. He waved at Alice. The men and his wife took off every stitch of clothing. Only the captain stood clothed in the midst of the stinking, naked humanity. The crew, of course, stared at her body, which was free of bites, but still interesting to them. They looked to the captain's eyes, and many of them decided they did not want to get caught looking on his wife like that. Others couldn't help themselves. Tobias, Lucian, Shy, and most others were bite-free as well. They covered themselves with their hands after inspection as Alice stood with her hands on her bare hips. 2 men showed pairs of fang marks. They begged and cried for mercy as they glowed with feverish sweat over their pale, naked bodies, but Mad Red offered them none. You proved yourself quite skilled with the Midnight Men, dear. How about you handle the release of these compromised crewmen, the captain said. Without bothering to get dressed, Alice took 2 stakes and plunged them into the hearts of the bitten men. She hoisted them over the side of the railing herself. She chopped away both their heads in one motion of her sword and pitched their bodies over before they could catch fire. As it turned out, they did not burn at all. Perhaps they had to finish their transformations first before sunlight and decapitation ignited them. All right. Alice turned about, walked between the crewmen, gathered her clothes, and walked naked to the captain's quarters. I'll be waiting in here for you should you need me, dear. Mad Red laughed, and the crew cheered with more enthusiasm as they dressed themselves, just happy to be alive. Red followed her in and slammed the door behind him. As he started to undress, he said, I'm sorry to have to put you on display like that, but you were part of this crew, and you handled yourself nicely on all fronts. As he stripped down to his waist, he paused to open one of the sacks brought back from the Midnight Men vessel they'd boarded. He put the trinkets out on his shelves around the walls. The last item was a bleached skull with long, sharp fangs. Quite a treasure this is, he said, with a quiet, almost childlike awe in his voice. The stories we will tell about this to our children one day. One day, she agreed, as she reclined upon their bed and closed her eyes.